This show is intended for mature audiences only. Viewers' discretion is advised. This show may contain strong language and sensitive or controversial topics. We are not attorneys and are not providing legal advice. The views and conversations are our own thoughts and feelings, and therefore, purely speculation.
The entertainment world and beyond.
Skywalker, air miles, feeding on a surface, glide on the water, constricted and conflicted.
Welcome to Purely Speculation, a show that exposes the harmful effects of the criminal legal system. I'm your host, Heather Lewis, the Executive Director of the Reuniting Family Bail Fund and practitioner of participatory defense. On this show, you learn about the unspoken horrors of the criminal justice system and meet fierce allies and advocates. We will make the best of our traumatic experiences. We will get angry. We may even cry. We most certainly going to laugh, but one thing's for sure, we're going to keep it real. Welcome to Purely Speculation.
When they free my sins and let them loose, they was killing me, I got scars to prove, got me paralyzed, I could even barely move. Out the way I took the pain again.
Hey, y'all. Welcome to episode 5 of Purely Speculation. And as always, we have a treat for you this evening. Every show is a treat. Every show is an experience and is exciting. And I just get excited every time we have a new show. And so you all, some of you may know that we went to South Africa a few months ago. And it's been a learning experience ever since. And so through that journey, I've learned that according to South African apartheid law, Robert Sobukwe, who we'll be talking about this evening, the revolutionary that initiated the uprising, that was the only political prisoner that's recognized by South African law. And in that journey, I met a phenomenal person who was our tour guide. So I can't say anything more about him because the story is just phenomenal and we just want to get right into it. So I want to welcome Toya Smith to Purely Speculation tonight, y'all. He was our tour guide, our maverick that led us through Robben Island. And before we get into Robben Island, welcome Toya Smith to the show. Welcome to Purely Speculation.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you, honor to share my experiences with you and the people of the U.S.
Yes, we're so excited. So since he said the U.S., Toya is in South Africa right now. He has been so gracious to stay up late. It is 1 a.m. his time, and grateful that he is taking the time to be here and share the story of Robert Sobukwe and just the history of South Africa and Cape Town and Robben Island. And so a little bit about how I ended up in South Africa is that I have a girlfriend who was turning 50 and she wanted to go to South Africa for her 50th birthday. And I was like, why South Africa? I'm like, the only thing I knew about South Africa was Nelson Mandela and apartheid. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like something I want to do. And she was like, no, it's a coastal city, world renowned wineries and food and restaurants and culture. And then you know what sold me on South Africa was seeing the penguins in their natural habitat. And we were like, what? There's penguins in South Africa? Yeah, there's penguins in South Africa. So that was what got me to the continent, other than, like, all right, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. I really want to take this experience and journey and travel with my friends and family. And it was such an experience. And so we toured the city, we did a lot of the touristy things, but when we got to Robben Island and when we got to the ferry, so we have to take the ferry to Robben Island, on the wall, there's a quote by Nelson Mandela. And Toya, you didn't know this about me until probably halfway through the tour, that I work in the criminal justice reform realm. Like, we fight for justice for people that are being incarcerated, mass incarceration, the disproportionate oppression of Black and brown people here in America. And the quote that was on the wall that met us at the wall by Nelson Mandela was that no man truly knows a nation until he's been inside its jails. And that just hit me so hard. I was like, all these politicians, all these law enforcement officers, like everybody that's in this system, spend a night. spend a weekend in jail, and then you know how people are really, how you really care about your people in your country. So tell us a little bit about Robben Island. Maybe start with Robert Sobukwe, because did that where Robben Island kind of became a thing, became Robben Island and the prison, or give us a little history about that.
Yeah, thank you. Just one thing. You are not the only one that had very little knowledge about Robben Island. I personally didn't have much knowledge about Robben Island. I started working on Robben Island in 1997. It was just a few days before after it opened up. And in all honesty, sitting on the boat, like you probably did, expecting to see an Alcatraz, one big building, a jail. And then the closer we got to the island, the more buildings we started to see. And it kind of gave me a sense that there were more to Robben Island than just the jail where Mandela was kept in. And through this journey, I got to learn a bit more of my own country that I never knew. Robert Sobukwe would have been one of the aspects of our country we didn't know. The fact that the island was a leper colony, a military base. It was a prison for over 500 years. And this, in a way, drew me to want to share what I didn't know with people. And it's 26, 27 years later, and I'm still on Robben Island sharing the story. Because what I got to understand was people like yourself who thought, what is there on the island? A lot of people thought it was just a jail, and others were surprised to see penguins on the island, were surprised to see houses on the island. And I think for me, it was not the foreign tourists that came to visit to find so much there. It was the South African that came, the black South African, that came thinking that they're only going to see a Nelson Mandela cell, to find that they too didn't know much about their own history. More importantly, the apartheid history that they thought they knew, that they didn't. And Robert Sobukwe was a huge aspect of the unknowns amongst the many other histories of the island. And like I said, it was a prison for 500 years. It was a dumping ground for the mentally ill, people with disabilities, a leper colony, and military base, Second World War, where there's a network of underground tunnels and buildings and guns that had a shooting distance of 20 miles. And so it's a layered history, but a vast unknown history for many. And like you said, you were pleasantly surprised to actually see what was there, other than Nelson Mandela cell, and to meet my colleague Sparks, who took you through the prison. And to find that it was actually someone that was locked up on Robben Island, who is the guy that takes you into the jail. And if I may just quickly share another part of my initial journey to the island. Not only did I think Alcatraz, but I had other perceptions. Perceptions like prison, and you think hardcore prison. You think Prison Break. You think Orange is the New Black prison. And the journey that I started with going over, now, firstly, it was an old prison boat. You see the hold where prisoners was kept in. But then you meet a white gentleman who you learned was a prison warden that is now working for Robben Island. And he's having a chat with a person he locked up. And you learn that they are colleagues. You learn they are neighbors living on the island, sharing a space where you and I might have expected the enemies became colleagues and neighbors. And these are the small things, that makes it unique. It makes it, an experience that a lot of people don't forget. And I was just glad that I was able to share a bit of that to a point that it made you think. And I think that is an important part. I think it's about leaving a thought and planting a seed for debate,
Right.
a seed for you to want to share more or know more or learn more or want to pick up that book and read a bit more.
Right. And that's the beauty of this platform, because you can be there, and we joke that, we'll get to a point that we'll be able to have you come over here and we'll have a live show, because there's so much to talk about, because you kept some of this stuff out of the tour, because I'm learning just now listening to you that there were things that I'm like, oh, the guns that shot 20 miles, what? So that's a whole nother thing. But we chose March for a reason, and we talked about Robert Sobukwe. So let's talk about him. Let's talk about March. Let's talk about kind of what kicked off the revolution. That was, since you said 1960 until like 1994. You know what I mean? That was been a long time. And we talk about how our history as enslaved Black folks here in America, 1960 is when we really started seeing like the civil rights movement and things really starting to change, and equality. That's like 80 years ago for us. 1994 for South Africans. So tell us a little about that journey and Robert Sobukwe.
When we look at political history, I think the world gets to know the African National Congress, or the ANC. The world get to know Nelson Mandela. The world get to know names like Oliver Tambo, and these were names that was out there, that was part of, what the world got to see, because these were the faces, these were the names that the media would have utilized. But it wasn't just one political movement. It wasn't just one particular person. It was a role a number of people played. So if we even start before 1960, with apartheid starting in 1948 and the different apartheid laws that was implemented, trying to suppress the rights of Black people in the country now. And I think we need to put it in this way, that it wasn't just white and Black. And I think a lot of guys coming from United States and other parts of the world, they see Black and they see white. In South Africa, it was Black, colored, Indian, and white. So there was 4 racial classifications.
Right. Yes.
The other important thing that we need to also understand is that you were not racially classified at birth or based on parents. It was a racial classification at the age of 16 when you applied for an identification document. So you officially became white, colored, Indian, or Black at this age. Now, that said, one of the laws that came out of this apartheid system was a law called the Pass Law. Now, the Pass Law was a law that would restrict the movement of Black people. So there would be a Bantustat where Black people could live freely, move around freely, and, whenever they had to leave that Bantustat, this rural area, to find work in more upmarket areas, to Johannesburg or Cape Town, where I live in, or other bigger cities, they had to get permission. And this was the Pass Law. So this permission was your identification document that will stipulate the areas you could be in, the times you were allowed to be in these areas. It was a punitive law whereby a police officer could become judge, jury, and executioner. For an example, a police officer could stop you at any point, at any time. Firstly, you have to have your Pass Law in your possession. Failing to have a Pass Law in possession was contravening the law. Then you had to be within what your Pass Law stipulated, time, area, and so on. And if you had to contravene any of these aspects, that police officer can become the person who arrests and imprison you. And for many, it was a 3 to 6 months imprisonment without a trial. I remember 3 years ago in December. Now, December is our holiday period, our summer period. So you tend to get a lot of South Africans that visit us. And there was a huge family in my vehicle. And we got to talk about Pass Laws and things like that. And the Gogo, the elderly lady of the family, talked about how she was imprisoned for 3 months for not being able to produce a parcel. But she says the problem was that en route to work, her bag got snatched, and she went to the police station to report the crime that was committed. And
Right.
before she get to the police station, the police officer demanded a parcel which she couldn't produce. It was in a bag, and she ended up in
Right.
prison for 3 months for not being able to produce a document. So these
They
were the
didn't care
punitive
about
parts.
women
Yeah,
either. Like
you know,
women, they didn't care that you were a woman with children or anything like that. It was just
I remember, talking about women and children. I remember another incident, and you must excuse. I've done so many of these journeys through Robben Island.
and you
There were
keep me
so many
taking you got me going
experiences,
all over the place too.
you know. And the one lady, her son decided to bring her to Robben Island. She was 70 years old, brought her from I don't know where they lived, but they journeyed over. And when we got to the Robert Sobukwe, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, she got up and told her son that when he was 4 months old, he had a very high fever. And in her panic, she left the house without a parcel and went to a hospital, got to see medical attention and everything. And on her way home, she was confronted. And she was very close to her house and she couldn't produce. And she got arrested and she had to hand over the 4-month-old to a neighbor to take care of him. And she was in prison for 3 months,
3 months.
simply because she forgot the pass at a house, which she said was literally a couple of 100 yards away. And,
Right.
and it was in the early 50s when women actually were the first to march to our parliament, to our president's office up in Pretoria, where they asked the government to exempt women from carrying the pass law. And the beauty of this march, which took place on the 9th of August, in the year just slipped my mind, but it was early 1950s, and it was over 30,000 women who marched in absolute silence to the president's office to hand over a petition to ask that they be exempted from carrying this pass. But to get to Robert Sobukwe and the role that he played, when he saw things were not going according to plan in terms of the passive resistance that the African National Congress was all about, he, raised his concerns, and eventually he and a few others split from the African National Congress. And this was in 1959. And started a political movement that was known as the Pan-Africanist Congress, or the PAC in short. And one of the very first defiance campaigns was to call on every single Black South African in possession of the pass to leave the document at home deliberately and to go to the nearest police station demanding arrest. So the idea was, will the country have enough prison space to house everyone if they all contravene on one day and at the same time? And this is what happened on the 21st of March, 1960. And throughout the country, the law was defied. People went to the police stations. They demanded arrest. And it was supposed to be a very peaceful, demonstration, to a point that they even told the police minister, the Minister of Justice, that there's no need for violence. People are going to come, open up the cells of the police stations, and then walk in freely. And in front of one police station, police took a very hard-handed approach. And behind these locked gates, they said they panicked. And when the panic stopped, 69 people laid dead in front of this police station in the township of Sharpeville. And the world got to know this event as the day of the Sharpeville massacre. So with that happening, it also showed the other political movements how determined the apartheid government was in making sure they were going to suppress this uprising, to a point that they banned political movements. Robben Island became the prison that we know it today. And interesting enough, the African National Congress, who had preached this passive resistance, even realized that they too need to look at the alternative, which led to the rise of what was known as Umkhonto weSizwe, the military wing of the African National Congress, and Nelson Mandela became commander-in-chief of the military wing of the African National Congress. But outside of Johannesburg, in Orlando West, Robert Sobukwe, leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress, and I need to mention that he was a professor in African languages. He was a highly educated man who took the leadership, actually gave up his profession, and he was arrested, charged with incitement, and found guilty. He was imprisoned for 3 years up in Johannesburg. But with the uprising, flaring up all over the country, with the apartheid government trying to suppress this by banning the political movements, and more punitive apartheid laws were being implemented, there was the leader of the most powerful movement that was about to be released from prison. And in 1963, Parliament passes a legislation not to govern or rule the country, but to govern and rule just in. They even called this the Sobukwe Clause. And what the clause was simply about was to re-arrest Robert Sobukwe when released from prison, isolate him, no one is allowed to interact with him in any way, and simply to confine him to a space for as long as they felt necessary. As a matter of interest, they said for 1 year. He was taken from Johannesburg, flown to Robben Island, and Robben Island has an airfield, by the way. Mr. Mandela and the co-accused was also flown to Robben Island by the small planes, which could land there. It was built during the Second World War, and he's flown to the island. He's taken to a little compound, a little house, where he was isolation. He was kept in total isolation. Not even the prison authority was allowed to talk to him. But the interesting thing about the Sobukwe Clause, this legislation, is that they now recognizes him as a political prisoner. And as a matter of interest, the apartheid government recognized him as the only political prisoner in the country. And with that, certain conditions had to be granted. Like, he could wear his own clothes. He was allowed to sleep on a bed. And I say sleep on a bed because the other prisoners up until the mid-70s slept on the floor. He was allowed books, newspapers, radio to listen to. I mean, I'm sure you will know that a clock is something they keep away from a prisoner, isn't it? Concept of time. He had a watch. He was allowed to write and receive letters, but the important part of this, no one to talk to besides himself.
My head my head is ready to explode, just like, because I heard that, and to hear it again, because it's like, okay, yeah, you did hear that correctly, that they created a law to rearrest him the day he was released. And so there's a couple of things. One, how brilliant was this man? Because like you said, he was a professor of African languages also. But two, brilliant, organizing, dangerous in their mind. But also too, so they recognize the difference between being a political prisoner and being a regular prisoner. Because everyone that came after him was a criminal in the sense, according to the law.
Before him. And before him.
Right. So how is that? Was that them showing some gentleness or compassion to him by making him a political prisoner, knowing that he's going to be here, significant amount of time, or that they like? Can you help me wrap my brain around how or why they gave him that status versus just locking him up?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but I guess what they were trying to achieve was to make sure that political movements and people have a fear to stand up against them, that they could pass a law to incarcerate you.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can do it to one man, they can do it to 1,000 people, 10,000 people. What happened in Sharpeville was just the tip of the iceberg of what happened subsequent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you look at the the Truth and Reconciliation hearings that happened after the fall of apartheid, where families were given the opportunity to understand what really happened to their loved ones, how they disappeared, how they died, be it in prison or detention. It also showed the brutality and how well thought out systems were under the apartheid government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was more about the fear that they tried to instill in the minds of people. Did it work? No, I don't think so. If you look and if you understand, I mean, you went through prison with Sparks, who was 17 years old when he became a prisoner on Robben Island. We talked about Tigang Museneki, who was 16 years old. I mean, these are just two of many young activists that decided to, education wasn't important for them at that time, but the freedom of the people was, that they would have taken up the fight against the apartheid government. So as much as I think the apartheid government was trying to instill a fear, they just made people more determined to overthrow the government.
Right. And so we're going to speak to, I guess, the incarceration of Nelson Mandela, because they isolated Robert Sobukwe, but they didn't isolate all of the others. And I think, well, in hindsight, that was a critical mistake, because if you realize that isolation is how you keep a movement from moving, then you would have 100 isolated political prisoners, not just one. So you put him over there, but you put 30, 40, 50 of the most brilliant minds of the movement in jail together. So tell us how that kind of played out.
Yeah, so
yeah, you told that story good.
Yeah, when you get the opportunity, like I was fortunate enough to have experience to work with former prisoners, to have gone through that island with Nelson Mandela in 1997, to have listened to so many other great minds, former leaders talk about their time in prison. I think what is important to remember is that almost all of them understood the consequence of fighting for freedom. And understanding the consequence of fighting for freedom, when you ended up on Robben Island or in that particular jail, it was not about, I'm going to sit out my 10, 15, 20 years and that's it. It was always about preparing yourself for freedom. It was always about the fact that freedom could come at any point, at any time, and you had to be ready for it. And one of the things that they would always do was to debate, to discuss, to keep fresh. And just the other day, it was Sunday, I took a former prison warden around who shared a story of how one of the prisoners would manage to find a way out of the prison and go to an old dump site where old newspapers was found, and he would scavenge the dump site for newspapers and smuggle it into the prison. And as much as that newspapers was maybe 6 months old or 10 months old, it was fresh news for the prisoners to talk about, to debate. And that's what they did. Education became part of prison. Each one could teach one. And and working in the quarries, and they would find time as much as. The funny thing is, talking was a punishable offense in prison. Talking was a punishable offense. And I asked Mr. Ahmed Kathrada, who was one of the Rivonia trialists, he was sentenced to life with Mandela, and I asked him if talking was a punishable offense. And all I hear about is how you guys debated and talked and educated. How did you manage to do this if talking was a punishable offense? And you know what was his answer? They sentenced me to life. What's the worst that can happen?
There you go.
And if you understand that thinking, that mindset, it kind of explains to you how they turned the disadvantage of prison into an advantage. If you listen to the prison warden who said to you that I came to the island thinking I'm locking up the biggest criminals in the history of the country.
Right.
And I soon realized that when I walked into that jail, I didn't have to have eyes at the back of my head, because the prisoner that was there wasn't there to assault me, but they were there because we were fighting a system.
Right.
And they were there to sit out that time given to them because they were not going to give in to the system by trying to escape or fighting the sentence given to them. And that is why they turned the narrative of that prison from a narrative of breaking the spirit and making the prisoner suffer. The prisoners changed that narrative into a place of critical debates and lifelong learning, to a point that when they were working in the quarries, they would break themselves up into groups of 5 or 6, but every group would end up with a teacher. But remember, you were not locking up that criminal per se, but you're locking up a lawyer, a professor, a mathematician, as much as they were literate and uneducated amongst them, but there were many that were not. And it was these guys that lead the classes. Eddie Daniels, who was in the section with Mr. Mandela, was sentenced to 15 years. He came to that jail with a grade 8. I mean, that's a 13-year-old school child education, and was sentenced to 15 years. When he left 15 years later, he left with a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Commerce degree. And that is what they did. They turned that narrative of that prison to a place of debate and preparing. I mean, I know when we went into the limestone quarry, I talked about this, and I shared that part of how they used a limestone quarry, an area of hard labor, into a place of debate and so on. I mean, we ended up with the most progressive constitution in the world. And if you sit down and you listen to them and you analyze what those debates and discussion was about, and you go through our constitution, which is the most progressive in the world, it's like, for me, it's like I go to work to a place that was our first democratic parliament, and not Robben Island, the prison. That is what I see every morning when I go to work, every day when I get off a boat onto that island. I feel like I'm getting and entering a space that used to be our first democratic parliament. I don't see it as a prison, as a matter of interest.
That's just so powerful, and you just say so much that it's like, all right, there's this one thought, let me just focus on this one, because you have so many gems and so many things. And you said something that we say here in the States is each one teach one, right? But there's one thing that you said that I've never heard here in the space of working with jail and the incarceration and things like that, is preparing yourself for freedom. That is such a powerful quote that I'm going to incorporate that into everything that we do, especially when we're talking about, we have a letter writing campaign now that we write to folks that are incarcerated. And that's going to be a line that's in every single letter. Prepare yourself for freedom. Because what you just described, it was a parliament. It's like, this is education you're coming out with. So if you're not learning from the people around you, not just the folks that have committed violent crimes, but there's other people there that, because they're not stupid. You know what I mean? They just made bad choices and get caught up in certain situations. But we joke about how savvy and business savvy and aware that drug dealers in here in America, they're running whole organizations and millions of dollars in product and this and that and employees and all these things. And it's like you said, this is a 17-year-old kid who didn't graduate high school, but he's got a multi-million-dollar empire. And it's like, okay, there's intelligence there, there's skill, so preparing yourself for freedom to come out, not necessarily to get back into criminal activity, but that you can come out and utilize, you're coming out with a skill set that you can use and revolutionize your community, your town, your city. You know what I mean? It's just so inspiring to me. Like I've always been, a reader and interested in stuff. And I love the storytelling aspect of it because it sticks with me. I can read books and I'm just like, I don't even remember what book that was. So it's just such a powerful thing. So you talked about the quarry, but talk about the day that Nelson and the prisoners were freed and that pile of rocks. Tell me the significance about that.
So just to sort of build a story around that. So the authority made two critical mistakes in my view. The one critical mistake was to throw all political activists into one jail. Mm-hmm. The second critical mistake they made was to keep all the leaders together. So the idea was never to allow the leaders to influence the other prisoners, so they were kept isolation. Hence, Robert Sobukwe was kept away from everyone else.
Right.
And when freedom came, and I think I need to mention one or two things, and I might be stepping on a few toes in the United States, but I don't know if you guys realize that the apartheid government was very clever in how they made the world see what they were doing. And what they wanted the United States and England to see was to see that they too were fighting communism. They were locking up communists.
Right.
Nelson Mandela was a communist, and everyone else was a communist. So in essence, they were getting support from United States and England, maybe not in the open, but there was support. I mean, we know about the Ronald Reagan administration that was reluctant to implement sanctions against apartheid. Margaret Thatcher called Mandela self-confessed terrorist. So when the Cold War came to an end, the apartheid government was almost the only government fighting communism. And when that really happened, you started to see how they were trying to change in the eyes of the world. 1985, as an example, the past laws get abolished and smaller laws get abolished. They started giving colored and Indian people representation in parliament, not a vote to run the government, but we can vote for you, but you're going to sit in parliament, but you have observer status. We call them puppets.
Right.
So they're trying to show the world we are changing. And eventually, there was a point where the apartheid government said, guys, we need to talk. And these political movements said, fine, let's talk. Here are demands, meet our demands. One demand was the unconditional release of prisoners. And by 1989, there's an agreement that by the end of April 1991, there'll be no more political activists in our country. And 27th of April, by the way, it was a day when the last group of political activists, and I use the phrase political activists purely because of Robert Sobukwe being the only political prisoner according to the apartheid government. I'm not saying Nelson Mandela was not a political prisoner. I'm just sharing it in context of law quickly. So 1991, the last group of political activists is released. 3rd December that same year, the negotiation sort of starts that leads the elections. And in 1994, Nelson Mandela becomes president. And in 1996, with the new constitution adopted, officially apartheid comes to an end. But in 1995, there's a reunion. And about 1,200 former prisoners returns to Robben Island. Remember, it's no longer that political jail. Yes, there were still convicts over there. I mean, the convicts were there till 1996. But that day, 11th Feb 1995, it was the 5th anniversary of the release of Nelson Mandela, and 1,200 former inmates, gather on the island. They have this reunion, and certain things were recommended. One was to turn Robben Island into the museum, and it was presented to Parliament. It was adopted, but at the end of this reunion, something very spontaneous happened. So Mr. Mandela is supposed to leave, greet, walk out, and once he leave that space, the others would follow. I mean, that's a normal protocol. President will leave, and others would then follow. But as President Mandela was walking out, they saw he had picked up a stone. And that stone he carried to the entrance of the quarry. They said he stood there for a moment and he laid it down. And as the others walked out, they followed. Each one picked up a stone and laid it down. And today, that pile of stones is a symbol of the triumph of the human spirit of adversity, the triumph of the human spirit of all odds. And it stands in the center of the entrance where these leaders worked, where these leaders would shovel limestone to build roads on the island, mindless work, but how they changed that space into a space of critical debates. But that pile of stones is not just a symbol of the triumph of the human spirit. Every single day, and I would say 99% of the time when I have groups, it's not just a group from England or the US or South Africa. I sometimes end up with 20, 30 different nationalities in one space. And what that shares is how different cultures, like in the prison, different languages, like in the prison days, different political minds, like in the prison days, now again comes together in one space. And that is what that space, that Palestine symbolizes, how the individual came into a jail fighting one enemy called apartheid, and the triumph of the human spirit of adversity, the triumph of the human spirit of all odds.
That's such a beautiful and perfect segue, because this is a lot, right? This is really, and as a young person in high school, and we're learning about apartheid and all of that stuff, you don't care, you're not paying attention, and it really doesn't affect you. It's just something that's happening. And now, as an older person, and realizing and grasping the gravity of how heavy and how oppressive that system was, and just to counter all the negative images that come out of the African continent. So we're going to go into a little commercial break. We're going to highlight some of your beautiful country, Cape Town, Franschhoek, and just show, and it doesn't even touch, the stuff that we've seen, but just to give folks a little glimpse into the beauty of South Africa and the beauty of the country, and explain to you why them folks came and tried to steal it, because it is a gem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a gem. So we're going to take a look at a couple of the pictures from my experience there and the beauty of South Africa, and then we're going to come back with our what the fuck moment. Thank you for that. And I was the photographer. I'm giving myself them photo credits. but I also lost my phone while I was in South Africa too, so I had to rely on my friends to send me the pictures that we were sharing while we were there. And so it's such a beautiful place. And my favorite was that poor little penguin. I don't know if his whole colony told him to go stand in the corner because he was the only penguin facing that rock. We're like, what did he do? He got in trouble.
Yeah, that's a famous Boulders Beach, isn't it?
Yes, yes, yes. And that was a treat. I really enjoyed, I mean, and there's thousands of penguins. I was expecting to see like just a few, and it's like, no, they're there. They're out there. And so I'm gonna let you I'll go first because you're gonna have to explain my what the fuck moment because it's one of the laws. So real quick. So this book I got on Robben Island. As I was leaving, my head was so filled that I got this book, I got some souvenirs, and I got a notebook because I had to kind of empty my head with all these things, and I didn't have my phone, so I couldn't even take notes. And so with reading, and I'm not even halfway through this book, and reading this book. So this book, that's a whole nother story, but this was the book that Nelson was writing while incarcerated on Robben Island, right? That he was hiding it. I have a picture of me in the garden of where he hid his manuscript. But there's amongst all the other oppressive laws against Black people, including like the pass law, there's a law called the Group Area Act. And this law has me so angry because of just the violent and oppressive and violent. I mean, I can't think about any other way. Is that if you, in one of the, I think Elizabethtown, that it had like 50,000 Black residents. It was a booming town. And all of a sudden white folks said, I want that town. And they moved, all the Black people had to leave. Like they didn't give you provisions. They didn't give you a relocation plan. They didn't give you anything. It's like, you gotta go. We want this now. Here in America, they burned that shit down. They didn't, you can't have it. I can't have it. Nobody's going to get it. They'll burn the shit down. They didn't move us out. But that's so please help me. You know what I mean? Like I can't evil. I don't know how to describe it. So tell us about that Group Area Act. Maybe you can soften it a bit.
Yeah. Let me try. Basically, what happened is with the introduction of apartheid and the 4 racial classifications, people used to live together irrespective of color of the skin, irrespective of religion. I mean, you would have picked up that Cape Town in particular is such a, diverse, multicultural, multi-religion space. I mean, not only Cape Town, there are many other parts of South Africa that is similar. But Cape Town had this vibrant part of it called District 6, for example. And in District 6, which is on the slopes of Table Mountain, it's very close to the city center. It was various religions, various colors of the skin all living. And with the apartheid law of Black people having to stay with Black people, white people having to stay with white people, colored people having to stay with colored people, they started with this thing called the Group Areas Act, where they would now identify a particular area and designate it for a particular color. And generally, the nicer areas, the more affluent areas that you'd have seen would have been white areas. So the Atlantic seaboard and the slopes of Table Mountain, where the beauty really is, would now be a white area. Cape Town CBD is the center of and the hub of Cape Town, and there was this vibrant community very close by, and they said, nope, that is not for you guys. We're going to declare it a white area, and if you're not white, you need to go. Mm-hmm. And they literally just took people's homes and bulldozed it to the ground. People had to be relocated, and this is where, I don't know if you heard about this area called the Cape Flats came from. No. And it was a sort of flat area on the other side of Table Mountain where a lot of these people went to. And this is where the townships come from, Kailicha, Langa, Guguletu, and so on. So there was now the black areas, the colored areas. Mitchell's Plain was another area. And the sad part about it is that people were now taken so far from where they were used to, where they were working. And literally it was bush that was now opened up, and houses were now built and developed for these people to go and stay in.
Right.
And so the Group Areas Act was all about, once an area is designated for a particular group, if you're not part of that particular group, you had to go, you had to move, you had to be relocated. And as sad as we might find that happened in the 60s and 70s, it's still very much happening in many parts of the world today.
Right.
I mean, we can,
Yes. They just call it
and,
different. They call it gentrification.
and whatever, you know.
Right.
And that is just the Group Areas Act in a nutshell. You know, obviously there's much more to it, but to give a quick glimpse of the brutality of apartheid, that they wanted to remain in power. They would have done everything in their power to stay in power. And if you were not part of their group, you were oppressed, you were shut out, you were forgotten, you know. But the interesting thing, Heather, it's still very, very much visible, wouldn't you agree? I mean, if you remember your drive from the airport to the Cape Town CBD, you see the shanty towns, and then you went over railway line and saw a bit of a suburb and so on. And that is how it was. You know, shanty towns was black people, bit of a suburb was the colored and Indian people, and then same road that you drive, you go past a golf course and some beautiful houses, which was the white areas, you know. And the closer to the CBD you got, the better the houses looked, you know. And and sadly, District 6, up until very recent, was still nothing. The houses they bulldozed, nothing went up after that. You would have seen, 20, 30 years ago, churches, mosque that was there. It wasn't religious buildings.
They
wasn't.
They took it and didn't even build on it. They took it and didn't even build houses. They didn't do anything. They just tore the shit down.
Exactly. And what's happening since 1994 is people has been given the opportunity of reclaiming their property, their land. And this is 6 is just one. I mean, one of the wine areas called Constantia. I have family that owned land in Constantia, which is now where some of the best wines come from. And the land was just taken from them. And they're not getting some form of compensation out of this. Families are not getting some form of compensation out of this. But that is what the Group Areas Act did. Took wealth away from the poorest of the poor and gave it to the white.
Yeah. And that is a strategy of those that, you know, want to stay in power, because that's definitely something that they utilized here. You know, again, the brutality and violent nature of oppression and staying in power. So what's your what the fuck moment? Because I mean, I can't imagine you got one more than what we've just talked about. So what do you got for me?
So here's a thought. And it's not only a thought for a South African. I think it's a thought for you guys. When we, and when I say we, I talk about the previously disadvantaged, oppressed people. When we look at our lives today, we look at bettering ourselves. And when we want to better ourselves, we want to move to a better area than what we grew up in, if I'm correct. Now, maybe not everyone, but generally, if you've got a bit of money and you feel that you're starting your own family, you need to improve. You need to give your kids a better life, a better area to live in, better schools to go to. What if we take our own community and make it a better area to live in? What if we buy property within our own community and uplift it to a standard to what you perceive to be affluent, better.
Right.
Change our schools. And I think it's about the changing of the mindset that we need to talk about. And it might not be mine and yours that we can change, but surely we can change the 5-year-old mindset.
Right.
Surely we can change the thinking of the kids of today. I always tell our South Africans that, you know, we can complain about crime, especially in the areas where crime is very high. And I say the sad part about we complaining about crime is that when we buy a present for our kid, we buy them a knife or a gun to play with. So how are we changing the mindset of the kid? Why not an educational toy? You know, why not a book to read, a book to write in? And I always say to the kids that visit Robben Island that when you talk about becoming an entrepreneur, don't think about someone starting their little sideline shop on the corner, selling a couple of things. Think bigger. Think about the doctor and you're an entrepreneur. Think about the lawyer opening up a law firm and becoming that entrepreneur. And I say to them that they need to look at themselves and understand that it takes 18 years of every person's life to become successful. And I say 18 years is from a grade 1 to your degree and a bit more. And I tell the kids, sacrifice your 18 years. I mean, sometimes I have 15, 16-year-olds sitting and I ask, you remember the first day of school? And I say, yes. And I say, well, that's 10 years ago. And I quit that 10 years ago. And I tell them that, you know, when we talk about Mandela Day coming up now in July, where you do 67 minutes of good, I'm sure you've all heard about this Mandela Day thing, and you go and clean a community or, you know, do some good at the old
MLK Day here, but yeah.
Yeah. And I tell the kids, take 67 minutes of your time every second day and do revision on the work you've done at school. And you take your 67 and you do it now and not when you were CEO of a company. And if you do it now, 10, 15, 20 years from now, you are starting to eliminate poverty. And when you eliminate poverty, you bring crime down. You better the system in your own community. And that is what I try to share with our kids that come to the island, to think differently, to not think about, oh yeah, you know, I'm in this rut and I won't be able to get out. You can. You need to change your thinking. You have to change your mindset. You need to change. And like I say, 18 years of sacrifice. And I tell the guys, when it comes to 18 years and you are 20, 23, 24, you can party with your own money, not your parents' money. It's money that you earn for, that you work hard for, and you can party. Don't party now. Party, you know, when you're successful.
Right. That is so powerful, and I thank you for that. And so you had two quotes that you wanted to share, and I think, you know, we just got lost in the conversation. So if you want to pop up or call out, there was one by Nelson Mandela and one by Jimi Hendrix. So it's interesting, the two very
Heather, just before we go to those two quotes, what happened in 1960 with the Sharpeville massacre is so important in our history today that come Tuesday next week, we have a public holiday in South Africa, not only commemorating what happened on the 21st of March 1960, but we now call it Human Rights Day. We now use that day to educate, you know, people about human rights that we didn't have under the apartheid system, and make people understand the importance of it and what the significance is about it. And you could see how important that particular day was in our history today, that we will celebrate it as a day where we learn about the human rights of people. And I thought that just before we go into that, just to conclude that aspect of what we were talking about, what happened in 1960. But I chose two quotes. The one by Nelson Mandela, when he said, never never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will ever experience the oppression by one, oppression of one by another. And the other one that I chose was by Jimi Hendrix. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. And why I chose those two quotes is about changing the narrative of the world, changing the narrative of the kids growing up today. And like I said, I've got a 1-year-old. I've got a 19-year-old as well, by the way. And
well, look at you.
COVID. We'll blame COVID, lockdown.
Damn it.
But the idea behind those two quotes is to change the narrative of the youth of today. Let them see it differently.
Yeah,
Change the world through their narrative and not ours. And I think with those two quotes, it kind of makes sense that, when we talk about the Group Areas Act, Mr. Mandela said it should never happen again, that we should ever find oppression by one over another. Right. And it's not a South African thing, it's a global thing. And I think Jimi Hendrix just summed it up. And I think that's too many power-hungry people out there. And I agree with you. I agree totally with you when you said we should take every leader of every nation and put them in a jail and say, talk. Don't come out of that prison till you find a solution to world's problems.
Right.
Obviously, that will never happen. But look what happened on Robben Island. It's possible to find solutions to problems.
Anything is possible. And this has been such a pleasure, such a joy. Thank you so very much for taking the time. I know I was following you around like a little puppy that day, and I'm like, wait, I need to know more about this. And who is that you said? And so we have the link somewhere about Robert Sobukwe. So I got the book. I haven't started reading it yet. There's a couple of different covers to the book, same author. And, we use this platform to do exactly what you suggested about changing the narrative, because there's so many different perspectives. And now that we're in this, century where video and TikToks and Reels and all these types of media outlets for us to be able to share our stories and be able to talk to someone thousands of miles away and get your perspective and not have to spend thousands, and I will spend thousands of dollars to get you here so that we can be in this space together and invite other people to share, because I just feel like there's something to be said about being in the presence of other people. You know what I mean? That energy and that vibe, and you know what I mean? That hug on people and love on people. And so, you know what I mean? That's something that we aspire to. And so to the folks that are watching, you know what I mean, please continue to like and share our show. We want to bring Mr. Toya Smith back because there's so much more conversation that we can have. There's so many more, so much more history and political activists and the folks that sacrificed for the global freedom of people and to do away with oppression, but also to, like our watch our show that we did last time, our court watching show, where we talked about the murder of a young man who was a father of 5, and then on the flip side, we had a huge success story of saving a young mom from serving decades in jail. So the work that we do is critical and it's important, and we want to share people's stories, and this is the best way that we know how to get it out there. We can write books. This is a thick ass book. You know what I mean? Kids today is not going to read that, but if we can tell the story about Nelson Mandela, and we can tell the story about Robert Sobukwe, and we can tell the story about all these other folks that are in the books, so that they can start grasping it. And when they get to that maturity level where they want to do that research and they can Google instead of buy a heavy book, that they can do that, and they've been inspired and they've planted the seeds. Like you said, we're planting seeds and trying to nurture the minds of these young people and changing the minds of older folks. You know what I mean? And folks that just didn't know this and didn't think about South Africa as a destination or a place or, something that had impacted the world. And South Africa definitely impacted the world. And so, Mr. Smith, My
I
gratitude.
just want to tell, I just want to tell your audience, if I may, that
Please.
there's a chapter of Robben Island that is closing quicker than what we expect.
Yes.
That chapter is Sparks
Yes.
not being around forever to share his story as a prisoner on Robben Island.
And he's of the last generation.
And every day
right?
we hear of a former prisoner that had passed away and so on. So to your audience, if you really want to hear the story of a former prisoner walking through that prison, don't wait too long. You might just get to South Africa, to Robben Island, and to find that there are no more former prisoners sharing their stories. And lastly, 2008, Nelson Mandela was officially taken off the terrorist watch list in the United States of America.
Yep. Amen. Well, we're going to get Mr. Sparks on. We're going to find him a corner where he can get some service. And I don't care what time it is here, we're going to get him so that we can preserve that piece of history, And so, Mr. Smith, I thank you again for your time.
No,
We're definitely going to have you back. Yeah, definitely going to have you back. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I hope our audience did too. So like and comment, share, subscribe, because the folks be like, oh, I need the link. Well, if you subscribe to the show, when it'll be on and it'll be in your on your feed. So again, I thank you truly, truly. I appreciate you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Purely Speculation. If you learned something, share something. Please like, follow, and share this show. The more our communities know, the more they are empowered, and the faster we can create change. Purely Speculation would not be made possible without the generous support of the Community Justice Exchange, the Health Sparks Frank E. Boston Black Justice Fund, Philadelphia Foundation, and Reform Alliance. Thank you. Booyah!
Intuition different, already lived and dreamt it. Visions make my vision clear as I'm jogging through this fog of life. I be fog light with the fog set, body and I'm all set. Baby, can you be my Cardi B on and offset?